Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream HY podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Bird. And so we'll be discussing Jennifer's journey in leaving Christianity. So, Jennifer, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me on again, Jacob. It's nice to be here.
Thank you for joining me. And by the way, I do have a link to Jennifer's YouTube channel tagged in the description below. So if you're not already subscribed to it, go over there and subscribe. So, I want to start us off with first, can you tell us about like this, the circumstances of how you became a Christian? Did you become one like from the start or a little bit later? How that happened?
Sure. Yeah, because I do know some of the scholars here in public biblical scholar world converted later, right? So that's an appropriate question to ask. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents, my family and I attended a United Methodist church all growing up. And for those who don't know, United Methodists are sort of from the Anglican church somewhat, because the Wesleyans started that, but they tend to be kind of a middle of the road denomination in terms of generally being into social justice, and not big proponents of evangelizing in the way that like I was an evangelist in my 20s. So much more focus on love and, taking care of the poor and and the unhoused and that kind of thing. So our church family was, it was our social life. It was our support group, it was our network of people. I was there every week, sometimes multiple times on a Sunday. And that was all growing up. I do have a funny story, though. I remember when I was about 8, I had just started attending a school that had encouraged more critical thinking or kind of thinking for yourself. And I got really annoyed listening to one of the sermons one day. And it got me thinking about like this whole idea of if God created the world in the beginning, as it says in Genesis, what was there for God to create the world into? Like that's also a thing that had to be created. And then where did God come from? Like I remember having those two questions as an 8-year-old coming out of listening to these people talk, and I didn't agree with their reasoning and it didn't quite all make sense. I remember going to school that week and being like talking to the kid in the line behind me, like, what, how does that work? And she just kind of looked at me like, what? So I kind of like that story because it ends up resonating quite well, right? Like 30 years down the road, or 20 years down the road. So anyway, I grew up in a church home. This was normal, like Jesus, the whole thing was just a part of the way I thought and taught and interacted. And then when I was in high school, I was a little bit annoyed with how kind of a medium Methodists aren't like really riled up, jazzed, excited, energetic people. They're very calm and loving and kind. And that doesn't vibe with my personality. Also, I was a teenager and I wanted a little bit more not bite in a negative way. I just wanted more oomph. I wanted more energy. I wanted more something. And I found that in a parachurch organization called Young Life. So I was involved with that in my teenage years. In fact, I was a volunteer with Young Life. It's an outreach, basically. It's an evangelical outreach to high school kids, some of the language they use is kind of trying to lead kids to Christ, right? So the ABCs, right? Admit your sin or believe Christ died for you and commit yourself to him. I mean, like the whole thing. That was a part of my language, what I was doing. And volunteering with that in college was, kind of concerning to my family because that was a very conservative swing to the right as far as they were concerned. And they just kind of tolerated me. I became much more fundamentalist when it came to reading the Bible. I was memorizing just swaths of the passages, just swaths of scripture, just so I could quote it as I prayed, use it in my language. I helped to start a whole new Young Life club at a new high school when I was in college. So that's a lot of time and energy that I put into that, as well as being a full-time student and also working part-time in addition to that. So this part of my life got a lot of energy and time. And I was very committed to it. I was a team leader. I volunteered, well, not volunteered, but I did a 2-year training program with Young Life after college as well. And that's a program they had. I don't know if they still do it or if I think it's probably altered a bit, but you raise your own support, so you live off of whatever you can ask friends and family to support you with monthly, I did not, it was a rough 2 years. Yeah, and it's a training program to see if you want to be on staff, like if that's the kind of your calling, for your life's purpose. And I thought I might want to be on staff with Young Life. Like I was very much committed to an evangelical approach to teenagers and to sharing the gospel, kind of trying to convince people that they're sinners and needed Jesus. And I meant that very much in a loving way. And I was very sincere. And I was very charismatic and very, had some decent leadership skills. People thought I would be really good in Young Life. I thought I might end up being like a president one day, like that kind of stuff. So that was a big turning point. Came from that because I got burnt out. I just didn't have any sort of personal boundaries. I just was absolutely depressed in a way I can't even, I just get in my car and I start crying. I was just strung out. So I left Young Life and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I moved across the country. From Virginia originally. I had been in Virginia Beach for those 2 years. And then I moved out to Portland. I had family there and I lived with them until I got myself settled a little bit and still kind of flailing because I didn't, I thought I was going to be doing ministry. So I I did have high school math teaching position in my pocket. I just was in Oregon now. And so I knew I'd have to take the test and do all the stuff, and I just wasn't up for that. So I did random things, worked at a Barnes & Noble, that kind of stuff. So, but in terms of my own faith, I was still very conservative, evangelical, was connected with a community of people about my age doing the same kinds of evangelical things and doing a lot of living intentionally in community with each other. I don't know if you've heard about that, Jacob. That's a thing that is popular within, especially young evangelicals, to hold each other accountable and, have community. And there are a lot of lovely things about it. But it's also tinged in this whole worldview and this whole way of thinking about people and the world that I no longer agree with. But I met some really amazing people, lots of people, both through Young Life and through this kind of community I was connected to in Portland, Oregon. And then I had a day. There was a day. I was just, I was flailing, didn't know what was going on with myself. And I reached out, as it turns out, to one of my former Young Life leaders who happened to be at Princeton Theological Seminary. And she's a woman, and I did not approve at that point in my life. I didn't give you any of those details. I definitely did not approve of women being ordained when I was in my Young Life phase, even though I had female pastors growing up. So this really important female person in my life was also potentially seeking ordination. And there was serious dissonance there, but I still needed to connect with someone. So I reached out to her anyway. I just needed to connect. And I did everything I could to avoid asking her about seminary. We talked for about an hour. And I was winding down because I was okay, I feel better. I'm going to go play. And I'm like, Jen, you have to ask her. It is so rude. Saying this to myself is so rude. You've just taken her time and you're not going to ask her about seminary, because I was afraid of what I might hear, Anyway, so I asked her. I'm like, oh, so how's seminary going? And that took another whatever. And we, by the end of the conversation with her, she had kind of convinced me I needed to go to seminary. So there's another piece of this story, though, and that is when I was in Young Life, I was, very. If you hear my cat, I'm so sorry. She's fine. She's just
it's fine.
Loud. Okay. When I was in the Young Life training program, those 2 years in Virginia Beach, this same woman sent me. She had done a 1-year Master of Liberal Arts. Excuse me. And at Hollins College at the time, and she wrote on the passage, what's known as the Martha Mary passage in one of the Gospels. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Hey, okay. And the passage is traditionally known and talked about as Martha is attending to the food in the kitchen, and she's upset that Mary is sitting there at Jesus's feet, not helping her in the kitchen. And she says something to Jesus about it. And it's typically handled that Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're worried about a lot of things. Mary has chosen what is better. Get over yourself. And that's a pretty typical handling of it. And you'll even hear in churches, doesn't even have to be conservative churches, you will hear in all kinds of church settings, women talking about whether they are a Martha or a Mary. Do they want to be a disciple of Christ and learn? Or do they want to do the quote unquote busy work behind the scenes, making things happen? And which are you gifted at or called to or whatever? And that's a thing, like it's a trope within churches, okay? But this woman handling the Greek found an interpretation that said, Jesus said to Martha, Martha, that Mary chose is better. And that might not seem like a big difference to you, Jacob. But to me, it was life altering. Okay. I just had Jesus through this, right? Just roll with it, right? I had Jesus affirm that it's okay for women to choose what it is they want to do instead of giving in to what's expected of them by men or by society. And that Mary chose what she wanted to do was more important than doing what was expected, which is what Martha was doing. This, I'm not kidding. I've told this story a handful of times, and I'm not kidding you. It like something opened up in the seam of the universe for me, like, and shifted and went back together. Like it was, it was to have, like, in my worldview at the time, like to have Jesus affirm that I can choose instead of giving it, like this was a very big deal, right? So this is the woman. She not only did she send me a copy of this paper, she named me specifically, like Jennifer Bird, as someone she knew who was really gifted, but was doing a Martha thing, giving in to what was expected of her instead of choosing to use all my gifts in a way, whatever that would be. So she's a big deal in my world, right? Like this is a woman who was very important for me. So when I reached out to her and I asked her about seminary, she had me, that paper, looking at the Greek for herself and being honest with what the Greek was actually saying. And then she was showing me a couple other things that she'd learned from taking, Hebrew and Greek and all the studying she was doing. And by the end of the conversation, I was like, I got to go to seminary to study biblical languages. Like I have been devoting my life to what this Bible says, and I'm trusting what men are telling me or what people are telling me. I wasn't super feminist about it at that point, but I was like, I'm trusting what others are telling me it says. I want to have a say in that conversation. So I want to learn biblical Hebrew, biblical Greek, so I can be a part of that conversation. And I had no clue what else I was going to encounter when I went to seminary. And I didn't even care, but I did have one kind of reservation in the back of my mind. And that was because, and this is a very common thing within conservative, it's fundamentalist, but also evangelical conservative communities, is this fear of learning, because there's a fear that if you learn too much, you might lose your faith. Like the evangelical, and I'm sure you know all this, right? From talking to people or just from observing, but it's all based on faith and what you believe, and exposing yourself to these other ideas that, that come from outside of the Bible and look at the Bible, like all of those things, it's like a slippery slope. You start, accepting one thing is different than what you always thought, and where does it end and all that. Like I went to seminary with this fear in the back of my mind. I even had someone invite me to his home to eat with his family. I didn't even know him that well, but he really just didn't want me to go to seminary because he's afraid I'd lose my faith. And I agreed with him, and I decided it was worth the risk because I knew that the Bible was important enough to me that I needed to study these languages, and I figured I could handle it, right? Whatever, so. So that is actually a fairly typical thing for people who come from, conservative fundamentalist, evangelical, any of those labels, those kinds of backgrounds, they will very much have a hard time even considering academic content about the Bible, much less giving it a fair hearing, much less, right, in taking it into their own thinking, because it does change things. It does, right? So I went to seminary still very evangelically committed, still fairly fundamentalist in the way I read. And there were a couple big pieces for me. One was women in leadership. I knew a lot of really talented women, in ministry, but I still kind of thought what my young life days had taught me to think about, which is, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. So of course women can't be ordained. And my mother had gotten ordained during this process. And it was just a crazy mess. So there was that. And I also was very uncertain about homosexuality. Those two topics, realities for people, were kind of big for me going into seminary, that I didn't know what to do with the reality of homosexuality, right? I knew people who were homosexuals and I thought they were lovely people, but I knew that my tradition and my faith thought that there was something sinful about them, right? Just as who they were. And I had never really had to confront and take on that issue. I just thought that homosexuality was a sin. I just did, because of the community I had been a part of. I will say, because of the community I grew up in. I grew up in a relatively small town. It's not a city, small town in southwestern part of Virginia. It was very segregated and very conservative. And so, I had years of thinking about it this way, and it's just what it was. It's just not a thing that God intended for people. So those were two big issues for me going into seminary. Along with just the whole, how do we, what is the Bible? What is it for us? And how do we, handle it? So, so I get to seminary and I start seeing some things I had no idea were there in the Bible that were possible in terms of the way people had been telling me to interpret it versus what it actually is saying in terms of the Hebrew and the Greek. And I loved the languages. I had such a good time learning them. And I was a Hebrew TA actually one year. I just love the Hebrew language. I think it's so beautiful, fun to work with, and sounds so beautiful. Just really enjoyed it. Anyway, so yeah, and then I started seeing, excuse me. Apparently I didn't get my throat cleared before I started.
So that's where your journey leaving Christianity began.
That's really where it kind of shifts. And, when I hear people talk about like deconstructing or leaving things behind, I understand that language and I understand why it's helpful. I really experienced this whole thing as becoming better informed, right? I wasn't, yes, it is. I think it's fair to say I have left Christianity because I don't agree with the traditional theology, but I think that there are conversations I could have with people in Christian spaces about more progressive, more reasonable ideas about God, for instance. So it's a tricky thing for me to say publicly, I love Christianity, because I'm not interested in the way God is talked about, the way people are taught to relate to each other, all of the language associated with church doctrines and hymns and prayers, and specifically the way God is talked about. But when I'm in seminary, one of the things you take is 2 semesters. So this is an intensive master's level history class. So 2 semesters trying to study the entire church history, which is 1900 years, right? That's a lot. That's a lot of names and schisms and different ideas and groups. So it's very fast, it's intense, and you don't learn it all, but you're exposed to a whole bunch of things, right? And these meetings, the councils, and who called them, and who was invited and who wasn't, and they were called specifically to oust this one particular person, and at the time I'm just trying to take it in and read it, and I didn't have this critical thinking stance as I first encountered it, but it gave it a year or so, and I'm starting to be like, wait a minute. There were only men at that meeting, and they called it to gang up on somebody. that's not love. Like, that's not, and let's look at their ideas. Ideas they're trying to excommunicate are actually more reasonable than what these people all believe. Like, what is going, you know, all these, I remember specifically, so you have a year, so 2 semesters of church history. You also have 2 semesters of intro theology, so basic theology. And at seminary at Princeton at the time, they were doing systematic theology. So you learned these different categories and how the ideas developed over time or whatever. And I just, one semester we were studying Calvin's Institutes, and I started out really excited about it, and I'm going to make my own, or like Calvin's Institutes is a 2-volume thing that's for Reformed people is kind of important. And I was going to make my own, like, chart it and make my own notes of the outline of it and all this stuff. And I was so excited, and my preceptor was very impressed with me. And then I finally, about halfway through the semester, I remember getting to it, I'm like, I don't agree with his premise. Don't agree with the premise that John Calvin is stating as reality that he then builds upon. What else is out there that I'm not also agreeing with? I don't actually agree with, I've just gone along with, and so that was another big chink. Like, these guys have some really, I don't like the things they think are right about God. I don't like that. And I was able to kind of distance myself from it for the most part, because there were other things to study. And I remember signing up for my second year, or was it my third year? Anyway, a feminist womanist theology class. And I'm not kidding you, Jacob, my roommate and I, because we were in dorms, my roommate and I signed up for it, but we did it kind of scared. Like, this was another layer of, there's something to learn here, but it's more about understanding your enemy. These feminists are just angry people. They're just angry women. And I don't want to be an angry woman. And I don't even know what womanist is, like, and I went in thinking, I need to understand what they're upset about. I need to understand what they think, so that I understand, just so I can guard myself against it. And of course, I get into this class and I'm like, I think they're onto something. There's a criticism of all this God language that's male-centered and all these things. Oh, and womanist. Oh my gosh, this is bringing in race to the whole situation. Oh, wow. And that was a huge thing for me personally, as a white woman from the South, or technically speaking from the South, having grown up in an area, our family was not wealthy, but we certainly always had food and clothes, I had a roof over my head. I never wanted in that kind of, so that's a relative privilege, right? So I'm a white woman of privilege from so having someone show me in the realm of theology how racism has played out for me, it was a big deal. It was a huge, this course, this womanist feminist theology course, looking at sin through a womanist lens, was cut to the chase for me in the big, this interest in evangelizing people, getting them to admit that they're sinful and accepting Christ, versus this whole other way of talking about humanity and if you want to use the word sin, the sins that are committed against people because of systemic issues like racism and classism and sexism. But for me, I had to look at the racism. That was a piece that was really big, and it shifted, it shifted something important for me. And, to say that I had a classmate look at me, an African-American classmate look at me, she said, "We've been sinned against." And I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't even know what that meant, but I knew she knew that, and there was something there, and I just had to sit with it. And, and it took me a couple of years to really fully understand. I mean, that's how deeply, ingrained this focus of you need eternal salvation, and that's the most important thing, versus looking at the way that people mistreat each other here. And this is the one life we know we have. How about we get this one right? Like, we really don't know what happens when we die, and I'm not really worried about it at this point in my life. So anyway, so those were big pieces in the, I don't know, you want to think of it as Jenga, pulling it apart, so that falling apart, taking those out. Those were conversations and points that were really significant for me in shifting. And, I was at seminary, so most of my friends were trying to find pastoring positions with churches that were for the most part pretty traditional, and they needed to get a paycheck and pay their student loans off, and so they couldn't fully embrace what I was learning. And since I wasn't committed to being ordained, I was there on my own. I didn't have a church sponsoring me and paying for everything. I was free to actually think and believe what I wanted to think and believe. And that isn't true for everyone. And there are lots of people actually who teach in seminaries who agree with me, but they're trying to meet people where they are and kind of gently bring them along or whatever. So it was scary, but I held on to a couple ideas as I went through seminary. And one was, if God gave me my mind, so it has to be okay to use it, in particular in this realm that is the most important for me. The second was, if God and the Bible can't handle my questions about them or of them, then they're not worth my devotion. And so those two things helped me get through seminary. I still identified as Christian for sure, but I was very much changing what I was committed to personally. And then I started PhD work, and I started at Baylor University, and Baylor University is Baptist affiliated. And at the time, I think it has shifted now, but at the time, every faculty member at Baylor University had to have their name on a roll at some church in town. If you think about that for a minute, where does that leave Buddhists or atheists, right? Like, they have to be members somewhere if they want a job there. So of course that's going to be, weeding out some people, but it's also, there are some people who really need that job. So they're going to have to find a way. And so I happened to landed in the church that all of those faculty members who were agnostic, atheist, Buddhist, whatever. I don't know if there were any Jewish folks, but it was a Presbyterian church, but it was very progressive. So anyway, in the town of Waco. And so I had a year of being there. I had these conversations with faculty. I remember the weekend, the Sunday before classes started. So my very first PhD class, I was invited to go to church with some of the people. One of the faculty members invited me, and I'm sitting at a table with like 6 different faculty in the graduate department at Baylor. Theologians, church historians, biblical scholars, just whatever. And the church we had gone to, they had used she to refer to God in the service. And I just thought, well, that's lovely. Look at this. And at the lunch, the theologian, the most senior theologian at Baylor University's graduate department, started ranting about that they had called God she throughout the service. And he was so angry, his face, I just remember watching his face turn red, like from neck up. And I'm sitting there. It had taken me, when I made the applications back in January, or just, whatever, I was one place theologically, but by the time I got there, I had progressed. I was much more, I'd kind of sorted it all through for myself. I remember I'm just sitting there thinking, I was a good fit when I first accepted, but I was not a good fit at this point. And that was literally the day before things started. And I just thought, oh shit, what have I gotten myself into? And that first semester, 2 big things happened. One, I was in a seminar on 1 Peter, which you may recall is what I ended up writing my dissertation on, as a segment of 1 Peter. And that was a big deal, not related to my own conversion or, changing out of Christianity. So I won't get into that. But the other was, I was also taking a seminar on Psalms, the book of Psalms, and in, Hebrew Bible, just because I loved it. So the midterm for that seminar, we had an oral exam. So each person went in to have an exam with the professor, and I did fine, just discussing the 6 books we'd read so far or whatever, and blah blah blah. And so he said I did fine on that. But then he said, so now, Jennifer, I need to ask you. You're asking questions that we just don't ask here. Are you sure you're a good fit here? And this is a really important story, I think, just because of what you do, Jacob, in terms of interviewing scholars and trying to kind of bridge the gap a little bit between what's happening in scholarship, theological, biblical, whatever, and a more general public. The ways that power plays out, and control and manipulation, and the issues of patriarchal certainty versus being open to conversations. These are big. It's a big deal. And so I had this moment with this professor. He was very kind. And then I continued that semester. And from there on out, he would counter everything I said. He would shut me down and not allow me to speak. And for some reason, I chose to take another class with him because I wanted to do a course on Amos. So it was even worse than Amos in the spring. And I mean, I got to a point where, because of the way this was all playing out, I was, again, another significant depressive episode, you could say. So this is all related, right? For me, it is all related, because what these faculty people were doing was trying to protect something that they, just like the guy who took me to dinner who invited me over to his family's house before I went to seminary. He didn't want me to leave my faith or lose my faith. These people in positions of power are protecting and doing this, gatekeeping kind of a thing on thinking, right? So I ended up, people are scared to think beyond certain things, and it does change things. It shifts power. Anyway, so I shared part of my story one time at SBL and talked about having suicidal ideations because of the way all this was playing out and shutting down the way I think, which was shutting me down as a person. And it was terrifying to me to think I was trying to actually get a degree in this way of being and thinking and behaving and asking questions and engaging the world. And like, what does that mean for me? If this is what I've decided to do, what does that mean for me? And I am not alone on that at all. Because there's no, because when I said that, someone came up, she was in tears, and she came up and she acknowledged, and it's a thing, right? There's a lot going on there that I'm not sure people understand. And it's hard to describe. So I ended up staying at Baylor for 3 semesters, and I decided I would drop out, reapply, and if I didn't get in somewhere else, then I would figure out something else to do. I would go teach high school math or whatever. But it was pretty terrifying that 4th semester that I decided not to continue, and I had to wait to hear from other schools. So the point is, with all of these, so that I ended up at Vanderbilt, and I remember the first, again, kind of the gatherings, the weekend before classes start. I had a conversation with someone, a couple people, and it was, let's see, that would have been 2003. So I would have been, 31? And it was the first time I had said out loud, Jacob, that I didn't believe that Mary was a virgin. I was 31, and it was scary to say. It was scary because I was at a place that, even though it was graduate school and it was academic space, I was talking to 2 people who I knew were Christian. And I was scared of what they were going to say. And I was right to be scared. So this, that year, 2003, 2004, like those 2 years of studying, I got to do 2 more years of graduate coursework, which was fantastic. And I loved every minute of it. Jacob, I woke up thankful to be there and to get to do and learn this stuff. And it was someone showing me how to do it, but it was like, oh my God, this is amazing every single day. Whereas I was literally suicidal before. So it was beautiful and lovely and fantastic. And also then gave me the space to breathe and to be okay with and find comfort in what I was deciding that I now believed, which was, this stuff does not work for me anymore, And in fact, 2004, Easter of 2004 was the first time I did not attend church for Easter. And I was scared. I was nervous. I didn't know what to do with myself not being there. Like, what? Like, that's where I was. I mean, that was 21 years ago, but still, it was, and I was just so upset or unsettled by it. I asked one of my faculty, like, you don't interact, you don't do a whole lot of one-on-one hanging out with your faculty in this kind of way while you're still student. But I did. I asked one of my faculty folks to join me for lunch at an Indian place, Indian buffet, so that I could just get through that 11 to 12 o'clock hour without like coming undone, So it's a process, right? It wasn't just a thing. It was lots of little aha moments, lots of this doesn't work for me anymore moments, but why? And needing to be able to find the language for that and be okay with that and having to process that for myself. That takes a lot of time when you grow up with this way of thinking. And and then also because I was very active in promoting this kind of thinking, it took a lot of time for me to sort it all out, sort through it, to be okay with it. And then that's when I got to the place where I was like, okay, there are some basics here that people in the pews need to be exposed to, even if it's not about leaving Christianity behind, but just like, there's some things about the Bible you need to know. Okay. So that's my story about, growing up and then how that shift. I don't like the word conversion or that kind of thing. I don't like that language, partly because people use the word conversion to talk about Paul, and I think that's inappropriate. And I prefer growing. I prefer language about growing, becoming better informed, having a broader understanding of the world and a less punitive and negative view of humanity. That was one of the big things too. So this was another piece of my shift when I was still in Baylor, when I was still at Waco. The second year I was there, I stepped in to fill in as the assistant pastor while they looked for a new associate pastor. And so as a part of that role, every Sunday I read the scripture and welcomed people, read the scripture. And then I also called people to confession and then gave the assurance of pardon afterwards. And I don't expect you to understand what those kinds of things are about, Jacob, but it was something I did every week. And in calling people to confession, I was weekly telling them they were sinners. And then after we all confessed, we'd read the confession, the confession that was printed in the bulletin, and then I would assure them of their pardon, right? But it somewhere halfway through, 3/4 of the way through that year, I just got sick to my stomach. I was like, I don't like this telling people they're sinners thing. It just is. I mean, that was what I was all about, like not even 10 years prior, right? But I was just sick to my stomach, literally, over saying this to people. I knew enough about the way negative things affect us as human beings, like psychologically. It takes 7 positives to counter a negative. And what are we doing when we're focusing on being sinners, but when we should be focusing on positive, like the goodness in humans? And this whole negativity around sinfulness and you're just a sinner and you need Jesus. I'm like, it just wasn't working for me. So anyway, that was another piece of my shifting away from and thinking differently. So then my life was, how do I do this? What can I offer people without seeming to be threatening to them, because I do not attend a church anymore, but I still want people to, I still think I have something to offer people who do attend churches, because I think there's a way to still be a part of a church if you want to, and not think these other negative, what I think are actually harmful ways of thinking about humans. So that's kind of the story, I suppose, in a 40-minute nutshell.
What would you say was the final straw that completed your journey out of Christianity?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting. Well, I mean, I think on some level you could say technically it was just, knowing that the resurrection is a myth, like Easter being a big deal for me, like not attending an Easter service was a big deal. And why did I decide not to attend Easter service? Because I didn't like the language. I didn't like the theology there. I didn't think it was appropriate. And I think that the theology focuses on the wrong thing. It focuses on this this idea of resurrection instead of focusing on the thing that got Jesus killed, which was you could boil it down to social justice. He was angry about economic exploitation of the people and political power over them. That's what got him killed. We're not talking about that. We're not actually talking about that in the, So I don't know if there's like one, thing that did it. Part of why I say that though is because I am still interacting with people in church spaces, and I don't ever come out and say, I don't agree with what you all believe. Like I don't ever do that. Because I want them to hear something of what I'm offering. And they're not going to if I'm actually really honest and say, I think that this thing we just read is a pile of crap. I have these conversations. Actually, my mother is an ordained Methodist minister, and she and my dad still attend a church, and they've actually talked about checking out the Unitarian Universalists, because that's more in line with how they actually believe. But because she's been a minister, she's still kind of hanging in there with them and helping lead Sunday school classes. And she'll ask me every now and then about like their book they're going to read. And I'm like, yeah, Mom, you're uncomfortable with this particular chapter, Mom, because you don't agree with this, but like you love the people, you care about the people. So that's why you're going. But like, don't pull me into this anymore. I don't think she even knows fully, right? I don't think she fully gets who I am. And I'm not interested in pushing that. I think that's part of this, why all this is tricky for me to come out and say it so publicly. Excuse me. So I don't know if there's, I'm sorry.
No problem. You all
I'm
right?
not sure why my throat is so groggy today. So yeah, I understand the question, what was the final thing? And I don't know that there was one final thing. I think there was just this culmination of the language, the focus on God as male and how that plays out for people. And all these things just piling up, and as I had time to sort it all out, Mary Daly is famous for the line, if God is male, then male, uppercase, male is God. And, I got to meet her actually, which is really a big deal for people in our circles. But yeah, and I'm kind of like her, like I'm I'm interested in like taking all of this language to its logical conclusion and pointing out that it fails us when, but she was seen as a crazy person because she actually thought her cats were a medium for her. And like she published some pretty progressive, provocative things, I guess. Anyway, so I think the thing is with changing your worldview, it doesn't happen overnight, and it requires lots of little bites and giving yourself some time to let that kind of seep in and to tease out all of the implications. It just takes time. So all of the language is big for me, I guess. I mean, I'm a math major, I'm a language person, I'm a music person. Like language matters to me. Pierre Bourdieu's book, Language and Symbolic Power, it's very important. I resonated deeply with that. And that's been an important piece of how I come at talking about texts and talking about their materiality for us in this world as we continue in communities, continue to read texts, let them dictate to us how to live and think and believe. So language is very important to me. So when you have language that in these spaces that talk about God as Lord, like I'm not okay with that. All the ways that tells us, all the hints that's giving us in terms of how we're going to behave. Children of God, when do you ever get to grow up? when are you ever an adult of God, right? Like there are just lots of little pieces in play that I was exposed to over the years because I was doing this intensively and seeking some of these things out myself, and all of the language, colonizing language, and looking at the language in the scriptures that talks about humans as being slaves of God. What the, like, like there's just a lot of pieces that I had to give time to all sink in. And so you could say 2004 was like when I closed the door to all of that, if you want. But I'm still in conversation with these folks. And, I understand where people are coming from. I understand where conservative evangelicals are coming from. I understand where fundamentalists are coming from when they say that the scripture is the word of God and is perfect and holy and all that great stuff. Like, I get it. I remember memorizing that scripture and what that meant, I thought and believed. So for me to make a big deal of growing beyond that framework, it's a little tricky, but I decided to do it with Derek, and I was pleased that you asked me to come have this conversation. But I'm much more interested in having conversations about growth and about learning and about not just hearing information, but giving new information time to settle in and see, kind of filter through your whole being and how you're going to be in the world and how you're going to think about things. So anyway, that's where I'm coming from, I guess, with this whole conversation.
So when your journey out of Christianity completed in 2004, what would you say was the aftermath? What was it like? What did you feel? What was interacting with other people initially like? Family, friends?
Well, I can tell you a couple, give you a few anecdotes. One, remember I mentioned that I had a conversation. I outed myself as not believing that Mary was a virgin.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that school year, one of those two people took me to lunch. Notice how these things keep happening to me else. Someone took me to lunch and told me I had also, by the way, actually chosen to enter the ordination process. I know that sounds really conflicting, and it really was for me. But while I was still in Waco, right, I had started the ordination process, and so I was kind of questioning whether or not I should continue the ordination process, since I couldn't acknowledge the parts of the Nicene Creed, which they would be asking me to confirm if I were ordained. But they ordained to a teaching position. The Presbyterians did, so that's why I was considering it. And I told these folks this, and I said, but I'm not sure if I should continue because I don't really believe Mary's a virgin. That's how it came up in the conversation. So this one guy takes me to lunch and says, I really hope you will withdraw from the ordination process because I love the church more than my own feet. It's a very strange thing to say. I don't really know what he meant by that. I love the church more than my own 2 feet, and I need to protect it from people who have beliefs like you. I mean, there are plenty of pastors, Presbyterian or otherwise, who do not believe that Mary was a virgin. They've just never had to say it out loud. They've never had a moment where they had to, or invited, or asked, right? Do you actually believe this? No, nobody's ever asked them. Anyway, that lunch pissed me off so much. I remember thinking, I'm going to stay because you just said that. I didn't want to do that just because of him, but it crossed my mind, Anyway. So there's that kind of thing that took place. What else happened? I mean, it's a great question, Jacob, because it's been varied. Like there were times when I was invited to come speak at a church, and because they liked something of my scholarship, and then I would get there and I would be a little too honest, and it would get awkward. I would push a little bit too much on, I think Paul might have been wrong or whatever, something like that. I would say things as I'm just doing this teaching, whatever it was they'd asked me to come teach about, and I would show a bit too much of my own true colors in terms of what I believe, because it's all about belief, right? This is a belief system that you're supposed to be committed to, and agree with and perpetuate, right? It's not about, I mean, ultimately it's how you live in the world. But so, yeah, it was awkward at times. It was, what I appreciate about your question is it takes me to a place of thinking about power dynamics and how if I'm having a conversation with someone who is Christian, who because of that they are, peripherally or tangentially, they represent the church in this conversation with me, I would often feel insecure. I would feel less valuable. I would feel like I was wrong for my beliefs, even though I'm very comfortable with my beliefs. So being in that space, having a conversation with someone, when I know that I don't agree, I feel like there's some, it's a hard thing for me to kind of push through and be like, no, I'm fine with what I believe. The power, that's one of the things, and that's part of why I persisted on in PhD work, and then in the things I have published over the years, whether as a graduate student, much more scholarly, or since graduating, trying to reach a more general audience. There's a pretty trippy mental game afoot, right? If you are trying to leave that world, if you're trying to leave the space where Christendom happens, if you're trying to leave a community, if you're trying to grow beyond what that community will allow, it can feel very scary. It can feel very lonely. It's pretty trippy, even for me initially as a PhD student, going to conferences and having conversations with people I met in seminary, for instance. And I don't agree. We used to believe the same thing, and I don't believe it anymore. I don't know if they've grown or if they're still there. So that's an awkward conversation. Sometimes not. I mean, yeah. I saw my preceptor, the one from theology, who was really proud of me for kind of doing my own outline of Calvin's Institutes. He did not know that I was no longer attending church. It was very clear that he thought I was, and he thought I was still that very eager theology student, and I was not. And it's like the onus is on me. Like, I have to handle what's happening here. He has no clue. And so am I going to just burst his bubble and say, actually, I think that's a pile of shit? Like, am I going to do that? Like, what's the polite thing to do here? What, I'm never going to see him again. Why would I be rude right now? Or why would I say that? Or is there a way for me to say something subtle but he's not going to hear it because he's not open to even that possibility that I'm not there. So there is a lot that goes on for someone like me. I know there are a lot of people who are in this process in lots of different ways, right? In lots of different positions, jobs in life, but they're still also trying to leave this behind, and it's awkward with coworkers, or it's awkward, like family members, all of it. Yeah, and interestingly enough, one of my siblings, I have 3 older brothers, and one of my siblings has become more conservative and more Christian in his thinking over the years, and as I have become less, and it's a very interesting dance with him. But anyway, I don't know. Did that answer your question at all in terms of what changed?
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh,
hey,
thank
Justin.
you. Hey, Justin.
Deconstruction Zone.
Yeah,
Thank you for your super chat.
Yeah. Sweet.
And so for my final question, what would your advice be to people that were stuck in the middle for a bit, like you were, trying to figure things out? What would your advice be to them?
Yeah, you always have good questions, Jacob.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you do. You have thoughtful thinking about what's helpful to talk about kinds of questions. What would my advice be? My advice would be to find a person you're safe talking with, give it time, right? Be gentle with yourself. Believe that you and what you're thinking and believing and growing, that's legitimate. And I think that this plays out with a lot of things in our lives in terms of when we grow beyond those around us or beyond what we were taught to think or believe or whatever on any particular realm of our life, that you don't always have to represent yourself. You know what I mean? Like there are conversations or times and places where you don't have to out yourself as not agreeing with what's going on or whatever, believing. There are times to just sit, there are times to just let people, be clueless. And yeah, I think the thing for me is I have a very, I don't think I'm unique. I'm just saying that this is a part of me, is I have a very, very active interior life, mental conversation life, thinking things through. I'm constantly observing and processing. And that helped me because I was assessing what was happening. I was thinking about what was happening to me or around me, what was being assumed, what people didn't know. And and then I would get in the car and drive away or whatever and process and be like, yeah, you're okay, Jen. You're okay. Like, this is who you are. It is sad that they don't understand or whatever. They're not going to be having that conversation. So whatever that is. So I think that people do that in lots of different ways. I know lots of people do what I do, but others find it helpful to, journal or to process with a friend or whatever. Find a way, right, to process and to reassure, to reaffirm who you are, I guess it would be my kind of boiling it down, my advice, I guess. Oh,
Tom Cruzol, thank you for your super sticker.
Yeah.
There is one more question I did think of, actually. What caused you to eventually start your YouTube channel?
Okay. Can I actually answer that after? Andrew Turnett had a comment.
Oh, okay.
A couple comments that, and I haven't been tracking with the chat because I'm trying to just focus on this, just chatting at you mostly, but with you.
Okay.
The comments, I swear I don't focus on belief. I swear. I appreciate that comment, and I might be misunderstanding what he meant by that. But I do think that there's something important that I want to clarify, and that is, as an evangelical, right? It was very much about beliefs, what you believe, and what you have, this belief system around, say, salvation, and what happens when you die. And my beliefs now are about, I believe in humanity, right? Like, when I say that beliefs have changed, I'm also aware that for me, what matters now is looking at the world around me and addressing the problems in the world. And that is found, that is underscored by believing that humans are mostly good, not sinful, and are, can come together, can make decisions and work together positively and make and change things. And obviously, and I'm saying this, 2 months into a presidency that's undoing things, the whole world. So there's that. But to me, it isn't about a belief system. It's about the fact that I have different beliefs that are much more positive about humanity, that do not talk. I don't believe in God the way Christianity talks about God, the way Bible talks in God. If there's a God, it's the thing that enlivens us as humans and the energy in the world. Nothing with intention, nothing with plans, nothing with all this stuff, God's will and all that stuff. Like, that's very, no, that doesn't exist, And so that different set of beliefs is about a different worldview, which then has, kind of given me a different direction and a different way of focusing on what I think matters, which is taking care of people and fixing the problems. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that, yeah, I do have different beliefs, but it's a whole different worldview. So you asked about why I started my YouTube channel, and actually, I started, so Derek Lambert reached out to me, I think it was 5 years ago now. And he had a friend of his, this was back when he had like 3,000 subs. So one of his buddies saw one of my YouTube videos, and then I created like 7 or 8 YouTube videos, I created 7 or 8 videos with the community college where I was teaching. Portland Community College has like 80,000 students. And so they have a big infrastructure, and they have full-time people doing, IT and videography and all that kind of stuff. So I created some videos that would be a part of all of my intro to the Bible courses, but they also make them available on YouTube. And so because of that, I did one on the 4-source hypothesis regarding the 3 synoptic gospels. So many people have struggled to understand it for whatever reason. And I was always, I'm kind of like, okay, I got to do something to help my students, because this is actually fairly interesting and simple. But I would look at the textbook I was using, Ehrman, for instance. I use his textbook all the time. I'm like, this is a terrible diagram. Like, this diagram does not work. Like, they were not very thoughtful in creating this diagram. No wonder my students don't understand it. So that's a video that's out there. And so one of Derek's friends saw it and said, hey, check out this woman. So Derek had me on, about 5 years ago, something like that. And I was talking about anti-Judaism in the book of Acts, actually, in that first conversation with him. And then he had me on again. And I remember, and each time I was on, especially those early conversations, he would chat with me a little bit afterwards about, what you're doing is really important, and we need more women, in this public space. And it's really something I encourage, I wish you would think about, or whatever, but at that point I was juggling 5 jobs year round. And like, I can't add anything to my workload right now, but I'll keep that in mind. So anyway, so that went on for a couple of years. And then I was in a position in the summer of 2022 where I was like, okay, I think I really want to give this public scholar thing a try. Like, let's just see if I were trying to be intentional about it. So that's when I kind of put some effort into it, and I started doing various things to try to build some attention and some subscribers or whatever. So I'm also moving on in a different way in terms of the work I do for my salary, but I want to continue to be doing some of this public scholarly stuff. So yeah, I'm going to continue my YouTube channel, probably change a little bit, but that's what got me started. Is I very much appreciate and want to help people who want to know some of these things that you don't necessarily get access to unless you have a voracious reading habit, or you're able to go to seminary or have these classes in undergrad, so yeah. So I'm very grateful to Derek for he nudged me a couple times, like, well, if you think about it this way, kind of talking about some of the benefits of YouTube stuff, how that could work for me. So anyway, yeah, I'm grateful to him for encouraging me to do that.
I'd like to remind everybody real quick that Jennifer's YouTube channel is tagged in the description below, and the links to purchase her books will also be in the description below and the pinned comment as well.
Thank you.
With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Jennifer.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.